Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm once again joined by Sywawish Riemann, who runs the Al Muqadimah channel on YouTube, which is dedicated to Islamic history and Islamic content, which I would highly recommend checking out. And he's also, and we will discuss this later in this episode as well, of course, which if you are watching on YouTube, you can see a beautiful Islamic poster that he has behind the wall, and that is sort of the entire timeline of Islamic history and that you can now buy on Etsy. A link will, of course, be in the description below. Now, we are going to talk generally about the Islamic world today, and I want to begin. First of all, you've been here 3 times already. This is the third time on this podcast, of course, and the first time I should probably say we talked about the origins of Islam, and in the second episode, we just where here I don't remember the name episode number, but we talked about Saladin, so you should absolutely check both those episodes out. Now, let's begin with talking about your new account on Etsy and what the idea behind the Islamic timeline, and of course your YouTube channel as well. Before we begin into the Islamic world.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be here again. So like my channel, the chart also focuses on the history of the Islamic world. This is a timeline, as it says behind me. It shows when different empires came into existence and when they died out. Like you can sort of see the influence of various empires, various regions. Um, over the Islamic world. And then there are like certain periods where you can see like the chart is not closed up enough to show. But um, for example, when the Mongol invasions happen, there's this part where pretty much all the empires in a certain area die out, and that's the Mongol invasions. And so Black Death and stuff like that is shown on the chart as well. Um, the chart begins with the history of with the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So, like, we can start there. The history of Islam begins with Prophet Muhammad, who existed from around 571 CE to 632 CE, roughly. He was a prophet in quite like the Greco-Judeo tradition. There were like a lot of prophets that existed in that time period, in that tradition, and so Prophet Muhammad was one of them as well. And he preached a religion that later came to be known as Islam, and it was an Abrahamic faith. These Arabs who were followers of Prophet Muhammad, they believed themselves to be descendants of Abraham through his son Ishmael. This is something that's quite well established, whether Abraham lived or not, whether he's a mythological figure or not. Um, the Arabs and quite a few people in the Middle East believed them to be descendants of Ishmael, or Ismail, as he's called in Arabic. Um, we know this from early non-Islamic sources, that when these invasions happened, people were calling them Ishmaelites. Anyhow, I'm getting ahead of myself. So Prophet Muhammad passes away in 632, and then we have the four Rashidun caliphs. Literally, caliph means successor. We have first Abu Bakr, then Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Three of these four were assassinated. So the empire was overall, while it was like this sort of an ethno empire, it was still like unstable because of all these different clashes, ideologies, etc. So Abu Bakr was the first caliph. He succeeded the Prophet after his death, and then he sort of worked out the chaos that started to emerge after the death of the Prophet. During the Prophet's lifetime, he had made alliances that put him in charge of much of Arabia, if not all of it. Like with various tribes around Arabia, he had made alliances with them, so they were paying tribute to him. And but then when the Prophet died, a lot of these tribes decided that we're not going to do that anymore. So Abu Bakr started warfare against these tribes, and he brought them back to the fold of the Islamic Empire. Um, But then Abu Bakr died after around 2 years, and him, he and he and the second caliph Omar, they were the architects of the Arab conquest. Omar was the primary architect. Like even during Abu Bakr's reign, Omar was certainly behind the idea that Islam needs to expand.
I
And
think we
so,
should, oh, if I may, I think we also should look at the greater geopolitical area of the time that we stay for, because in the
mhm,
meantime, while this is happening, we also have the third, what I like to call the 30 Years' War between the Eastern Roman state
yeah,
and the Persian Empire as well. And as I think most modern scholars agree that this war is also because they were distracted with in the Roman Persian War, that the conquest of Islam was made, I wouldn't say easy, but it was made easier and was able to do so rapidly because both states were distracted in the war fighting one another. So I think
mhm,
as well we need to take a look at that
yeah,
factor as well as to why the Islamic conquest spread so rapidly.
yeah. I was coming to that. So, as all of this was happening in Arabia, to the north, there were two giant empires. There were the Sassanid Persians and the Byzantine Romans. If you want to call them that, you can call them Romans or Eastern Roman or whatever you want, but I'll just stick with Byzantine. Um, they had been fighting each other for 30 years by this point. By, I believe, the war ended 628, right? Um,
I think so. I'm not sure.
yeah, something like that. Just a couple of years before the death of the Prophet. And during that war, the Persians had laid siege to Constantinople, and the Romans had come within spitting distance of Ctesiphon, the capital of the Persians. Um, Much of the Middle East, including Egypt, had changed hands. Some cities had been sacked. Um, all resources had been depleted, financial, human, pretty much everything had been depleted. I mean, imagine, a 30-year war between these two giants. And this was not like a Cold War, this was an active war. Um, and due to this, these two empires were exhausted. Their holdings were just simply, there was a lot of rebuilding that needed to be done, and they didn't have the time. They hadn't had the time to do that when a threat emerged from the east. Now, during the 30-year war, there had been some some problems in terms of Arabia that they faced. The Romans and the Persians both had tribes on the borders of Arabia that they paid. They paid them to keep Arabia in check, make sure that no raiding, etc., happens
Yeah.
from there. Um,
And also
and
they made the local tribes fight each other, to
yeah,
keep. They didn't
so there
want
was like,
united Arabia.
yeah, they weren't interested in ruling Arabia, but they were like keeping it, it
Yeah.
busy and just make sure that it doesn't do anything. But they had been distracted from that during the 30-year war. So because of that and a bunch of reasons, um, when this threat appeared in Arabia, they could not actually meet them properly. When Prophet Muhammad united people, they were united behind sort of these ethnic um, unity, but also this new faith, right? They believed themselves to be the descendants of Abraham and the the heirs to the Middle East. Um, Certainly, even though the Quran has a chapter called Rome, it's about Rome. But despite that, the Muslims saw themselves as the true heirs along
Mm.
with the Jews. It wasn't like separate from the Jews, along with the Jews. And these Christians, especially these Trinitarian Christians who believed in the Trinity, and in their mind, the mind of the Muslims, that was paganism, uh, that was polytheism. Muslims believe that these Christians were not fit to be the
Mm.
rulers of this
And I was
this
coming to that as well. In at least in the early days, the Romans and the Persians kind of looked at the Muslims, and of course, I didn't call them that at the time. But I was just to simplify, they thought, like you said, they thought they were just another sect of the Jewish faith, because they had, like you said, similarities between them.
Yeah, and these earlier sources, they don't talk about Islam in terms of like a separate religion. And we don't actually know. There's all this speculation, but we don't actually know if Muslims believe themselves to be a new religion or not. They talk about earlier Christian sources or non-Muslim sources in general talk about the fact that the Saracens or the Arabs have united behind a leader named Muhammad, and that they're attacking the Middle East, the larger Middle East, but there's no idea that they are Muslim or Jew or whatever. There's no mention of their religion, even as late as the Venerable Bede. He talks about, I believe, in the 730s, I think,
Yep.
he or 20s or 30s. He talks about Muslims, and just he says that the Saracens have invaded Spain, and that's it. There's no particular idea of this new faith, of this new religion. So a lot of people did probably believe them to be Jews, mostly because of the fact that they were circumcised. That is specifically mentioned. There are mentions of these circumcised people. So there were, yeah, probably, and to be honest, if you bring both Islam and Judaism to the same language, the two religions look very, very similar.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's, I don't think that Muslims would be offended at being mistaken for Jews, especially not that early on, because early on when we look at, and this is sort of a revisionist idea for sure, but when we look at um, early Islam, uh, we see that there were like these very basic ideas. There was the idea of the unity of God, that there's only one God, the end of days, that the world is gonna come to an
Mm.
end, and that was like, Islam was kind of an apocalyptic religion. Islam was pretty solidly in the. Are you able to hear me?
Yep.
Islam was pretty solidly of the idea that the world is going to come to an end any day now, and the third idea was migration. Um, uh, what's in Arabic is called hijrah. The idea that the world is coming to an end and the world is corrupt, and you must go and set up communities of people who are good. You have to migrate, and so that was like sort of the theme behind the Prophet as well, moving to Medina and establishing a state there rather than trying to do it in Mecca. And early Muslims in Greek sources are called Mahagirun, which is the Arabic word Muhajirun, which means people who have performed the hijrah, or people who have emigrated. Uh, so yeah, these three ideas, like, these are very simple ideas, and these ideas also exist within some extent in Judaism, and so, like,
And
yeah,
very much so in medieval Christianity as well. You can
yeah,
say that medieval Christianity was a very apocalyptic religion.
yeah, and when you I was reading about this. I don't actually remember the name now, but I was reading about this slave who lived in the United States, and someone asked him. He claimed to be Christian, but someone asked him to write something, some part of the Bible, and he wrote the Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran, and like that was basically the Lord's Prayer in Arabic. Like, it was
Yeah.
pretty similar. So yeah, there was like a lot of these overlaps between these religions, and the earlier conflict was not necessarily about religion. I don't think that, because Omar, the second caliph, was very pragmatic. But we'll get to that. So, the Roman Empire and the Sassanid empires had been exhausted, and the Muslims united behind this new religion with renewed vigor. They they invaded. They first started raiding, um, but then the raids turned into like this simultaneous invasion of Persia and of um, Syria and Palestine. Around the same time, they were. Sorry, I don't understand. So I said Syria, and Siri on my phone has gotten activated for some reason.
Mm-hmm. That's fine, don't
It's
worry.
Yeah, Apple really needs to do something to dumb it down.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's and then Muslims started invading. They quickly conquered. They broke the Roman army at the Battle of Yarmouk, which pretty much marked sort of the exodus of the Byzantine Empire from the region. And they conquered Jerusalem in 637, I believe. Um, Off the top of my head, these dates always get muddled. They conquered Jerusalem, and then they conquered like much of Syria and Palestine, and on the other side they conquered much of Iraq. The Byzantine Empire was able to, fall back to Asia Minor, to Anatolia. Now, Anatolia is a pretty mountainous region, so it was like very difficult to penetrate for the Muslims. But the Sassanid Empire could not do that because their capital was actually in Iraq. It was on a plateau. It was pretty accessible to the Muslims. And the Sassanid Empire collapsed completely as soon as when Muslims entered their capital. The Sassanid Empire collapsed.
Hmm.
And the Byzantine Empire could have collapsed as well. Like, if it was not an empire based in Constantinople, maybe Damascus, it could have collapsed as well. But it was saved by the fact that it lived. The empire was based in Constantinople and not in the Middle East itself. So anyhow, the Sassanid Empire collapsed, and the Byzantine Empire, like, they lost a lot of their territory. They lost pretty much everything south of Anatolia. Syria was gone, Palestine was gone. Eventually, Egypt would be taken as well, and that's where I think that the Muslims were not, like, this was not a religious conflict. Rather, this was driven by pragmatism. So Omar, when he had conquered what is today Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, etc., like these countries, he had conquered them. He didn't want to move further. He had already given a shield to his empire. There's the Zagros Mountains, like the range that goes from like Iran to Anatolia. So there was like this shield around the Islamic Empire now. He did not want to move into Egypt. He wanted to consolidate his power in Syria, in Palestine, in Iraq, etc. He didn't want to move into Egypt, but he was overruled by his governors and his advisors and like council, Majlis Shura as we call it, what could be considered the Congress of the Rashidun Caliphate. So Egypt was invaded as well, and so slowly over time, Muslims, the Arab conquests, they went roughly to Tunisia on one side and India on the other. But that's pretty much like where they stopped, because the empire itself fell into chaos. And that chaos came at the death of the third caliph, Uthman. When Uthman was assassinated, he was assassinated because of a lot of like tensions between these different groups that existed within the Muslim empire. Now you got to keep in mind that the Muslims were, let's say, by the time that Uthman came to power, Muslims were around in Libya to parts of Afghanistan.
But as
Generally speaking.
sorry for interrupting you, but I think we also should address that only in the early, at least first 300 years of the Islamic empires, we should also address that the minority were Muslim, because they were,
that's what I was coming to.
Yeah, because they wanted to. They had this juicy law. Sorry if I say this wrong, but they had the taxation law that non-Muslims didn't want. Had to pay a tax to practice their faith. So they were hesitant in actually converting people because they benefited so much from the taxation.
Yeah, that's what I was coming to.
That the non-Muslims gave, say Christians or Jews, gave to the government.
Yeah, that's what I was coming to. So, like, Muslims ruled somewhere, like, let's say from Libya to Afghanistan, but they were less than 5% of the population, at most 5%. They were ruling over Persians, Zoroastrians on one side. Half of their empire was dominated by Persian Zoroastrians, while the other half was being dominated by Christian Byzantines, Greek-speaking Byzantines. And, imagine these two people who had been fighting for 30 years, and now they were living together under one ruler. Well, it looked like that to the Muslims. It wasn't actually like that. Like, the Persian part and the Byzantine part wasn't really all that connected, because the Muslims, they weren't trying to build infrastructure. They weren't trying to exploit taxation. They weren't trying to do any of that, at least until like the reign of Omar. Wealth was being generated through warfare, tribute and stuff.
Yeah.
But these minorities, they had a lot of problem with the fact that this new this new small minority was now ruling over them, and Muslims did not try to rule them from their cities. Again, the idea of migration comes in. Muslims ruled from these sort of garrison cities called Amsar. An example is Kufa in Iraq, or Basra, or Fustat in Egypt, or in Tunisia, there was the city Caravan in Tunisia. It's like all these cities that Muslims founded these cities and they were ruling from outside. They were basically just occupying force that was keeping everything in check. And it wasn't like, in today's world, you would want to exact taxation and do all that. That wasn't happening, not under the Rashidun Caliphate. So there was problems in terms of who is going to get the benefits of the conquest. Putting the minorities aside, what about the Arabs? What are we going to do about the Arabs? So in terms of like the Arabs, there were all these disputes about, my grandfather converted to Islam, so I should get a larger share. Your father converted to Islam, so you should get a smaller share, stuff like that. There were all these disputes. And in the middle of that came Uthman. Uthman was he was a member of the Umayyad family, and the Umayyad family sort of had this very strict familial connection with each other. They only trusted each other. So he started putting his family
For
members in charge.
family.
Yeah, exactly. In italics. So he started putting his family members in charge of like different places throughout the Islamic world, and that brought up charges of nepotism, corruption, etc., etc., etc. And so there were a lot of people who were unhappy, and so he was assassinated. And then came the fourth caliph, Ali. Now Ali was reluctant to punish the people who had killed Uthman because Ali had come to power with their support. But Uthman's cousin, Muawiyah, who was ruler of Syria. Syria was a very powerful province. Syria had been like this core of the Byzantine Empire. It was full of Christians, and Muawiyah was the governor there. And Muawiyah decided that I'm not going to swear loyalty to you until you punish the people who killed my cousin. And Ali didn't do that. So there was this first civil war in which various people were actually against Ali. It wasn't just Muawiyah, the Prophet's widow, Aisha, and some of his close companions, Zubair ibn Lavam and Talha, were against Ali as well. And there were two very major battles where Muslims fought each other. It was the Battle of the Camel between Ali and the Prophet's widow, Aisha, and the Battle of Siffin between Ali and Muawiyah. And anyhow, long story short, Muawiyah won the civil war. Ali was assassinated by rebels, and Muawiyah won the civil war, and he established the Umayyad dynasty.
The Umayyads they didn't know their civil wars, didn't they?
Yeah. And it was under them that we started to see Islam, and we started to see empire, and all these ideas start to come in. Taxation, diplomacy, all these things. Like I said, the Rashidun Caliphate was mostly just an occupying force. It was conquering places, and it was like not even exacting taxation from them. It was just like taking tribute from them, not taxation. Like it wasn't that this province has this much farmland and it's generating this much of a certain crop. We gotta tax 10% of that, 20% of that. It wasn't like that early on. It was under the Umayyad that these things came in, jizya and taxation and stuff like that. And so when Muawiyah came to power, there was this, again, the idea, the fact that half of the empire was Christian and half of the empire was Zoroastrian wasn't just going to go away. So Muawiyah, when he became caliph, he went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He prayed there. He did all these things to appease the Christians, because Syria, his base, was largely Christian. His supporters were largely Christian. One of his wife was, or his primary wife actually, was Christian. So Muawiyah did all that, and at the same time he tried to rule with like a very light hand, to make sure that everybody could do what they want, just no rebellions, no trouble. You are autonomous, pay tribute, and then do whatever you want, just no trouble. And Muawiyah was very good at that. He was able to keep the Zoroastrians happy. He was able to keep the Christians happy. During his time, actually, we get this bill of sale of a donkey, I believe, which is written in both Greek and Arabic. I think it's the first papyrus document that's in there. I don't remember. Like I said, that I research things for my videos and then I can kind of forget them. It's in one of my videos about the history of paper, where we have this document, this financial document in Egypt that's written in both Greek and Arabic. And so that, that tells you that sometimes we imagine that, an empire comes around and sort of
Yeah.
old systems just fall apart. That was not the case. The people who were speaking Greek, they were a lot of people. Muawiyah came to power in 661, and the prophet passed away in 632, and the conquest happened. This is like 30-year period. There were a lot of people who were alive at the time that Muawiyah became caliph, who were alive before the prophet died, who had lived under the Byzantine Empire, who spoke Greek, who used Greek coins.
I mean, it's kind of silly, and I said this in my last episode as well. When it's kind of silly that it suddenly, when to think that suddenly when the Umayyad caliphs came and conquered everything, the Greek provinces, that they, it's just that in a snap of a finger that they suddenly spoke Arabic now, and it's silly to think that that's how it happened. I imagine it must have taken at least a couple of generations before Arabic became the lingua franca of that area.
Yeah, and I mean the same is true with. I had never actually thought about this before, but when Christianity came around, the Hellenic people of Rome and other places, they resisted that. There's a movie called Agora, which is it's not a very historically accurate movie, but it shows the tensions pretty well between the Hellenic people and the Christians. And after watching the movie, I realized that I never thought about it, but this happened. This probably happened. There are these two people who are now living together, and there's this time of change, so stuff is gonna go up. But the transition between transition that came from Islamic conquest was much smoother than that. Like we don't know of any major riots that Christians or Jews or Muslims were fought each other or stuff like that. The caliphs were able to keep those things pretty smooth. It was not until the year 1000 that we can safely say that a majority of the Middle East was Muslim, and even then, just a majority, like maybe 52%, 55%, like that. There were still a lot of Christians and Jews. Like you read that during the Golden Age, there were a lot of Jewish scholars, Zoroastrian scholars, Christian scholars. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself.
I actually want to. You kind of brought me in nicely because we kind of touched a little bit about this when it came to taxation, and I mean, and now to practice the faith. And I think a lot of scholars of today are looking much more closely into this as well. Is how when we speak about tolerance, it's easy to think about what we think of as tolerance in the 21st century. But I think we have to look at it differently when it comes to what we think of tolerance in the 6th and 7th century as well. Was it like, the happy utopian world of that we think that everyone were happy being allowed to practice their faith in the Islamic world? Was it kind of harassment as well? I think we need to reconsider what actually tolerance in that time were about, and how tolerant were they really when it comes to practice and not just on paper when it came to this. We know for a fact that, I don't remember the color codes, but I know that the Christians and the Jews had to have different colors on their clothes that show that they were Christians or Jews, I believe, if I remember correctly. So that's just for a brief minute, just how tolerance actually worked in practice, and how it's not really what we think of in the 21st century as tolerance when it came to religion.
Yeah, I think I often use this example that I think if you really boil down history, really generalize history, then it's a struggle from being part of a collective to being individuals. Like in the West today, you are judged as an individual. No one's going to look at your family. No one's going to look at your tribe or ethnicity. Like, ideally, right? No one's going to look at these things. You're going to be judged.
People do, but
Yeah, that's what we imagine. But that was not the case 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, you would be judged as part of a group. If your tribe made a mistake that you were not part of, and if they all get killed, you're probably going to get killed as well, even though you were not part of that. And so people were like judged in terms of religions. Like if there was a Christian ruler, he's going to look at Muslims with suspicion, and he's going to look at Jews with suspicion. And if a certain set of Jews rebel against the Christian ruler, or Muslims do that, all Muslims and Jews are going to get punished for that. And that was unfortunately how things went back then. And we saw this during, let's say, uh, uh, well, every time period. You know, if you were a member of the ruling class's faith before the United States, there was no secular state. Before the United States, there was no state where you could, like, I mean, at least an idea the United States was supposed to be secular, but um, it wasn't. It wasn't. There was no state where you could be a member. Well, you could not be a member of the ruling class's religion and enjoy the same privileges as them. And the same was true for the Islamic world.
I mean, it's easy
Um,
to it is easy to judge this coming from a 21st century perspective, but we have to take a look at the hard facts of the day in the 6th, 7th centuries. That what it actually was. We have to take that into consideration, and I think we talked about this in the Crusade in my first Crusade episode as well. That you have to take the fact that while it's easy to judge the hypocrisy, they didn't think about that necessarily at the time. So it's just you also have to take a look at the world that that they lived in that time, and not
yeah.
judge it from a 21st century perspective. We have to set
Mhm.
ourselves in the 7th, 6th century mindset as well. What would you do if you had to set an example, for example, in that time?
Yeah, definitely. And the same was true for Islamic empires. Like the Islamic empires, uh they never, like, there's no claim that Jews and Christians were equal to Muslims in Islamic empires. But sometimes they were things were pretty good for them, sometimes things were pretty bad for them. I think that goes from king to king
I think it was
rather
slightly
than,
better than, say, European
yeah,
Jews.
it was definitely better than that. Like for Muslims, Jews, like today, I was just talking about this with a friend, and he was saying that, dude, the Middle East has been on fire for 2,000 years. And I was like, no, it hasn't been. If you look at a book of history about, let's say, Gaza or Jerusalem, um, you will see that, okay, Jerusalem was conquered in 637. And then things become pretty boring. There was nothing happening there until the Crusades came around. And then
Mm,
there was violence for 200 years. And then things become pretty boring. And then you come to like 1918 when it was conquered
yeah.
uh, by the British. And so, like, it's been largely not peaceful, but it's been largely uneventful.
Mm,
And so Muslims and Jews have been living together, and it was totally okay. At various points, uh, non-Muslims had to pay jizya. At various points, they had different sets of restrictions placed on them. Sometimes they weren't allowed to preach their faith. Sometimes they weren't allowed to even like uh, uh, publicly talk about their faith. And sometimes they were allowed to do these things. Like, for example, under the Fatimid Caliph Al Hakim, things were pretty bad. He
yeah.
destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but that was like an exception to the rule. Um, the physician, there was this guy called, we'll come to that later, but during the Golden Age, there was this physician called Al Hunayn ibn Al Ishaq Al Ibadi, who was a Christian, and he was the physician to these caliphs, and he was the head of the house of wisdom. And there were all these other scholars coming in, even rising up to the ranks of like the highest uh, positions in Islamic empires. But at the same time, you do see certain restrictions being placed. Like, for example, there was this one time that the Byzantine Empire attacked the Abbasid Caliphate. And the Abbasid Caliphate at the time was going through some inner turmoil. There was like a lot of damage done on the border. In the 860s or 70s, I'm not sure. But at that point, there was a riot against Christians, and a lot of Christians in Baghdad were killed. So there were these periods of tension as well. But largely, I think, generally speaking, it was pretty good. But under the Umayyads, things were bad for everybody who was not an Arab Muslim. The Umayyads were what you can call Arab nationalists. Like, it's today's world and it's today's terminology, and it's not 100% accurate, but you can kind of say that. they wanted to turn the empire into, rather than sort of falling into this Roman or Persian identity, they wanted to maintain their Arab identity and propagate that throughout the Islamic world. And they did that. It was Abd Al Malik who made 690s or 700s. He made Arabic the official language of the empire. And so he brought Arabic to a level that it had never attained before. It brought it to a level that English has today, or Latin had in medieval Europe. And at the same time, he started to put these disparate traditions about Islam together and form Islam into a cohesive narrative. And it's in 692.
So he kind of did a Council of Nicaea in a way for Islam.
In a way, but not as official. Like the Council of Nicaea is like very official,
Yeah.
right? It has a date and
I mean,
it's
just
a
to
year.
do a comparison.
Yeah, you can kind of do that, but it's not exactly like that. And it's in 692 that Abd al Malik came to power that we actually first see the mention of the Prophet Muhammad in Arabic in Islamic sources. If you put the Quran aside, then the name Muhammad does not appear in any Islamic sources until 692.
Wow.
And that's on the Dome of the Rock, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem today. At the same time, in the same year, we see it on the tombstone of a woman in Cairo. The name Muhammad appears, and it's like under Abd al Malik that these ideas, these disparate things, start to come together and form the core of what we today remember as Islam. There's a book called the Quran, the Umayyads, which I think which goes into detail about how the Umayyads sort of consolidated the Quran and so did all these things. And there are the revisionists, actually, like Stephen Shoemaker and quite a few others, believe that the Quran was actually assembled under Abd al-Malik. It was Abd al-Malik and his governor Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf who actually assembled the Quran into its book form. Which is something that I personally don't believe, but a lot of revisionists believe that, and there's a lot of good arguments for that. So the Umayyads, like I said, they were the ones who started to bring Islam and Arab and empire together. They started to create what Hugh Kennedy called the executive caliphate. Muawiyah was living in Damascus. Muawiyah ruled from 661 to 680.
If I may go back to, sorry for interrupting again, but if I may go back to Abd Al Malik for a second as well, something I think we should mention as well is the Islamic coinage. It started to form as well under Abd Al Malik, and until now, I believe they use Byzantine coins. But it was under Abd Al Malik that you see the first true Islamic coinage in there. So. And a lot of people, and I believe Peter Frankopan believes this, and we talked about this in you before, but it has been believed that it is actually the Prophet that is on one of the first coins of, and not Abd al Malik.
Sorry to interrupt you. That's what I'm looking at.
That's fine. Yeah, 5
Okay, so let me start with Muawiyah first. Sorry, let me start with Muawiyah first and talk about the coins. Muawiyah lived in, like I said, Damascus, and he was very much aware of the Byzantine tradition, and so he tried to mint the first Islamic coins. But he was trying to, project his power as an emperor. He built this small palace in Damascus, which Byzantine ambassadors actually thought was pretty bad. They said that, well, this palace would do for the rats. Like, that's how they thought how bad it was. And Muawiyah built a coin. Muawiyah minted a coin which was then not accepted by the Christians or the Zoroastrians because they didn't want to use a coin that didn't have the photo of the Christ or their sacred imagery on it. And so Muawiyah's coin was rejected. But then it was not until... But then from that period on, Muslims minted coins. In Persia, they minted coins that were pretty much the same coins as the Persian ones, with some Arabic on them. And the same was done in the Christian parts in Egypt and in Syria, where they had these coins that were pretty much copies of the Byzantine coins with maybe the statement "in the name of Allah" written on it, or maybe the name of the caliph. The coin that was printed, the coin that was minted in Persia even had the illustration of Khosrow Anushirvan, who was a famous Persian king, on it. And so like that shows you how much influence these people still had, and of course they would, because it was not that long ago that that the conquests happened. But then it was with Abd al Malik that we get the first Islamic coin. What can we
You
call the
actually
first?
have one with you. That's
I do,
actually, I believe,
yes.
in an original coin. It's just a little closer.
Yeah.
That was a cost of fortune. Whoa, that's so cool. I mean, if you're watching, go to my YouTube channel and actually watch this episode if you're listening to it on Spotify or anywhere else, because it's so cool. How old is that one now? And
Well, this was minted in 695.
oh my, that's so
Um,
cool. That's amazing.
yeah, and this is a figure. You can see that this is a guy who is like standing. He's got a robe. He's got long hair,
Yeah.
and he's got a sword in his hand.
Yeah.
And then around it you have the Bismillah, which is in the name of Allah. And what else is written there? Actually, I never. And Muhammad, not
That's so
Muhammad,
cool.
something
That
about
was
the
a cost
Prophet
of
Muhammad.
fortune.
This one was not that expensive because it's in a pretty bad shape.
Yeah.
See,
It's still
it's not.
pretty cool. Still pretty
Yeah,
cool. It's over
it,
1,000 years old.
it's actually like I was waiting for something that was good enough, but was also not too expensive. I just dropped a coin that's over
That's fine.
1,400 years old.
That's amazing. That's incredible. How often do you say that every day? That's not something you say every day, is it?
Exactly. And then on the back you have the cross,
Yeah.
because again, you have the North Star, the star.
That was an original Byzantine coin that they just remade. Wasn't it?
No,
Or
the
is that
backside.
yeah.
No, the backside is like the Byzantine thing.
Yeah.
And the front side is Abd al Malik,
Yeah.
or some sources call it's the Prophet. They say that
And
it's the
what do you
Prophet.
think there? Because there's some debate whether it actually, and we should also say that early in Muslims they weren't necessarily afraid of depicting the prophet. So on pictures as will later Muslims would. But what are your thoughts? Because Peter Frankopan believed that that this is the prophet on the picture, but scholars kind of go back and forth on this. What are your thoughts? Do you think it's Abd al Malik, or do you think it is the prophet that is depicted on the coin?
I think it's Abd al Malik. I don't think it's the Prophet. And the reason that I don't think it's the Prophet is because the propaganda of the Umayyads was not about the authority of the Prophet. It was about the authority of the Umayyads. The Prophet was this spiritual leader, right? This religious leader, this sort of high above figure. But he was not the king. Abd al Malik was the king. And so I think that that's what this is supposed to be. And I don't imagine that Abd al Malik would be putting the Prophet on a coin that would be used by the Christians and the Zoroastrians. I think that if this was the Prophet, maybe they would have rejected it. Like, imagine a Christian is now forced to use a coin with not the Christ, but a guy on it whom they don't know at all. So I personally am not convinced by the argument. I know that there's a lot of people who've made this argument, but I personally am not convinced by this argument. But yeah, this is also the first image
That
of a
was
Muslim.
super cool. That was super cool to see.
It's the
I mean,
first
it's not every
image
day
of
I
a
see a
Muslim.
1,000-year-old coin, So
And there's another fun fact actually.
Be my guest.
Sorry, give me a second. No need to pause the recording. I can just show you that.
Just 1 second. Yeah, you had another fun fact.
So this is sorry for the shameless plug, but this is the logo of Al Muqadimah.
Yep.
My channel, and the logo actually is based on the face of the figure on the coin.
That's awesome.
It's quite difficult to see on this version of the coin, but his face is. You see those two lines, and there's like this thing.
If you like I said, if you're listening to this, and you can go to the YouTube channel as well, or
you see the face. There's two eyes.
If you Google the first Abd al Malik coin, you can also find a clearer photo if you want to see. But that's so awesome. That's so cool to see. Something I want to talk about that I don't think we talked about yet is the conquest of Iberia as well, because we have to talk about the Umayyad branch in Spain and how that conquest as well.
Yeah. So it was after Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik stabilized the caliphate. He brought Islam together and he brought the Arab identity together. So he did a lot of things for one guy. And then he died in 705. And under his son Al Walid, the Arab conquests rebooted. At that time, he started sending his armies out. In the year 711, two very important parts of the Islamic world were conquered. First, in the East, India was conquered. In parts of what is today Pakistan, there's a province called Sindh that was conquered by a guy called Muhammad bin Qasim in 711. On the other side of the Islamic world, Spain was conquered in that year. There was this army sent by a governor named Musa ibn Nusayr, who sent a guy called Tariq ibn Ziyad into Iberia on a raiding mission. It wasn't like a proper invasion, it was just a raiding mission. But then they discovered that Iberia was in a pretty bad shape at the time because of a coup that had been in the Visigothic kingdom. The Visigoths had been ruling Iberia for about, I think, 200 years at the time. I'm working on a timeline of Spain and I don't remember things. I just forget things
You and me
quite quickly.
both.
Yeah. And so the Visigoths had been ruling, but then there had been this palace coup a couple of years earlier, and Roderick wasn't able to secure power, and it was sort of a civil war-ish setting going on in Spain. And so Tariq, who was just leading a raiding army, he was able to defeat Roderick, the king of Hispania, in 711 at the Battle of Guadalete. And that opened Iberia up to Muslim conquest. So by 715, they were able to take all of Spain. And it was all of Spain. I'm getting a lot of feedback to a poster that I'm working on that the Arabs never conquered Santander and like parts of the north. But they did actually conquer that. And they lost it pretty quickly in like they ruled it for less than 10 years, but they did conquer it. The guy who founded the kingdom of Asturias, Pelagius, was actually a rebel. He was not like a sort of independent governor. He was a rebel. And that's where the kingdom of Asturias came from. So Muslims at one point for less than 10 years ruled all of Hispania. There's, like I said, there's this general misconception that it wasn't all of it, but it was actually all of it. But yeah, then the Umayyads back in Syria tried to rule Spain for about 50-ish year, 40-ish year, and they weren't able to do a very good job at that. In the meantime, back in Syria,
Actually, I want to go back to Spain again before you go to Syria, because I want to talk about, for just for a second, the Battle of Tours that would happen a little bit later. And
632,
we
732.
spoke about this in a joint history episode, which was a really fun episode to do with Eleanor Yanagro. And we spoke about this in the last episode as well, how the Battle of Tours wasn't this big deal as Dubin or other historians made it out to be, and that there would not probably not have been Muslims in England, and it probably wouldn't have been conquered the entirety of Europe, because there wasn't. I don't think there was much interest of them in Europe, but what are your thoughts on the Battle of Tours? Do you think it was a big deal as people made it out to be, or did you think it just was a little, like I do, that it was just a bit skirmish wee bit skirmish from the Islamic point of view?
It was just a raiding mission that failed. Like, Muslims ruled Narbonne for a while, right? And all of that was just, it wasn't like real rulership. It was just rulership by default. Muslims were there, and no one else was. So that's kind of the thing. And when the Martels rose up in France, they took a lot of that back, right? And the same was the case in Tours. It was a raiding party. It was a raiding mission. And even if let's say that they had won, even if Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi had won the Battle of Tours, The most important thing that would have happened is Charles Martel would have died. Right? Actually, let me check. Sorry, I gotta confirm one thing because I've been thinking about this for a while now. So Charles Martel, his son Carloman, was born in 713 CE. And then Pepin the Short was born in 714 as well, and he was the father of Charlemagne. So yeah, I don't think much would have changed if Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi had won. If, let's say, and it's likely that if al-Ghafiqi had won, then maybe Charles Martel would have died in the battle. But he had his son, Carloman existed, Pepin existed, Charlemagne would have existed, it wouldn't have changed much. When was Charlemagne born again? Charlemagne was born in 748. So yeah, but it's likely that things would have gone roughly the same way that it did. Maybe the Martels wouldn't have come around as the powerful Frankish dynasty. Maybe some other dynasty would have rose up, but it would have been the same thing. If Muslims had won, let's say, all of Spain, they probably would have been stopped at the Rhine. All of France, they probably would have been stopped at the Rhine. And then they would have pushed back. They would have been pushed back pretty quickly after that.
It wouldn't have been the end of Christianity either, because
Yeah,
as we have talked
definitely.
about, they wanted them to be Christian for taxation purposes. So we thinking that would be the end of Christianity, and we talked about this on our chat group a while ago. The books that I shared, the heroes that defended Islam. I don't remember the author's name, but it's silly to think that the heroes who defended Christianity, I think is the title of the book, The Battle. And it's silly to think that Christianity would not have died out, because, like you said, they were quite tolerant when it came to religion for taxation purposes. They still would have wanted them around. They wouldn't have eradicated everyone or turned them suddenly into Muslims.
And for them to slowly convert Europe, they would have to stay there for 300 years.
Yeah.
And there's no way that I see a Muslim kingdom existing in France for 300 years. Because it was just too far away from the rest of the Muslim world. And Muslim Spain had the same problem. Muslim Spain could not get any help from the Middle East because it was too far away. The Navy, there was naval connection, but no one back in Syria after the year 750 was interested in helping or taking Spain.
Yeah.
And the nearby empires, the empires of Morocco, were too different to actually be able to rule well in Spain. And the same was true for France. They could have been this minor kingdom that existed there, but it would have been destroyed pretty easily by the Franks, by anybody who is. It wasn't the end of I think Edward Gibbon also said that if Martel hadn't won the Battle of Tours, today the Quran would be taught at Oxford, which it is. You can teach the Quran at Oxford. You can learn that. But yeah.
They had the oldest version of the Quran in Oxford, or is that Cambridge? I don't remember.
That's in Birmingham. Birmingham. Yeah. And yeah, that's you can study the Quran there. But yeah, Edward Gibbon was a bit. He was not a fan of Muslims.
He was a bigot, to put it that bluntly.
There was this guy called George Sale who translated the Quran, and he was not very hostile to Muslims in that translation, and Gibbon called him half a Musliman for that. So Edward Gibbon wasn't the biggest fan of Islam. But no, the Battle of Tours, I don't think that there was any way that this could have been the end of Christianity, or could have somehow upended status quo. Maybe the Martels wouldn't have rose up. Maybe, if Charles Martel dies, we don't get his sons coming into power. We don't get any of that, sure. But some other dynasty would have largely been the same. Yeah.
Now, I think it's time to talk about the rise of the Abbasid and Caliphate, and how and the end of the Umayyad Caliphate, and how the Abbasids came to power.
Yeah, before that, I'd like to announce that this video is not sponsored by Marvel. It's just a mug that I really like. It's the Hulk mug.
But if you want to sponsor Marvel, you're more than welcome to do so.
Yeah, definitely. We can discuss the Battle of New York here.
Oh, that
Uh,
100%. I mean, it's a
yeah,
historic battle, so it's perfect.
exactly, exactly. If you go to New York, it's still a shithole because of that battle.
Absolutely. But yeah,
um, Back to the Abbasids. So, the Umayyads, under their rule, they basically treated everybody who was not an Arab and Muslim as second-class citizen, and they did have this policy of not converting Muslims because not converting people to Islam because they got jizya from them. So it was extra taxation. And as people started converting to Islam around the end of the Umayyad Caliphate, we saw that the Umayyad Caliphate was actually hit by the fact that they were paying more taxes. They were losing taxes, and the empire sort of had monetary problems at the time. Um, but yeah, as Caliph Hisham died in 743, I believe, or 741. Yeah, not sure.
did
His
they just last a little more than a century or so? They didn't last that long
They didn't
when it
last a
comes to.
century. They lasted like 90 years,
Yeah.
from 661 to 750, and it was like that. That was the thing that, despite the fact that they built the empire and did all that, there was a lot of discontent. Like I said, they were what can be called Arab nationalists, and
And then
so
had a lot, like 3 civil wars within
yeah,
that lifespan.
within that lifespan, and a growing number of Muslims was non-Arab. Persians were converting to Islam. Egyptians were converting to Islam, and all of these people were discontent. They weren't happy with it. They were like, "Dude, I don't know what Quran you're reading, but the one that I'm reading says that we're all supposed to be equal." And so the Persians, they rose up from Central Asia under a guy called Abu Muslim, which
To
literally
the
just
modern
means,
comparison, it's like modern Christian versus other Christians.
yeah. um, so it's kind of like that. But then the revolution rose up from Central Asia under a guy called Abu Muslim, and he started conquering. We don't know if Abu Muslim was one guy or multiple guys. It was just a guy called Abu Muslim. He started conquering, or they started conquering Iran, and then they came to Iraq. And at the Battle of the River Zab, they defeated the Umayyads, and that was pretty much the end of the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyads were broken there. They had no military left. The caliph escaped to Egypt, was caught and killed, and that was pretty much it. And at that point, they were. I'm not sure about the early Abbasid propaganda, but there was no real Abbasid propaganda in that way. There was this propaganda about a successor of the Prophet, someone from the Prophet's family. So going back to the Shia-Sunni split, I don't think we've talked about that.
No, we
Um,
haven't.
yeah, so there was, when the Prophet died, there was this debate between his followers. Some of them wanted
Two
uh,
hundred years earlier.
100 years earlier.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, there was this debate about who's going to succeed the Prophet, and there were a lot of people who wanted Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, to succeed him, while others supported like more senior caliphs, like for example Abu Bakr. So like that was the crux, the very basic of the Shia Sunni split. The people who support Abu Bakr are Sunnis, the people who support Ali are Shia. And then that sort of continued. Ali became caliph, but then he was resisted by Muawiyah, and then slowly that discontent started building up. People still remembered that Muawiyah, the founder of the Umayyads, fought Ali, and so there were like these two things, that it's the Umayyads and the descendants of the Prophet um, through Ali. And in 750, or before 750, in the 740s, when there was like a lot of people talking about a revolution, they were talking about a descendant of the Prophet coming, a member of the Prophet's family coming to power. People thought that meant that a descendant of Ali, one of his great grandsons or great great grandsons, would come to power. Um, but what happened was the Abbasids came to power. Now, the Abbasids were not descendants of the Prophet. They were descendants of the Prophet's uncle, Abbas. So a lot of people weren't exactly happy with this. A lot of people weren't happy with the fact
Is
that,
that,
they had been duped.
if I may, I want to ask, because a lot of people who come to power usually use lineage to justify the claim. So was it really descendant, or is that something that they kind of you just use to justify their ascendance to the throne, for lack of better words, or is that a loose claim, or do we actually know that they are indeed from the prophet's uncles at lineage?
I think that claim is true. First, if you were going to claim a relationship with the family, you could do, like, if you were going to make a claim up, you could do a lot worse than, you could do a lot better than Abbas. Abbas had all these question marks on his character. You could maybe link yourself to one of the prophet's other uncles or to one of his cousins, but they link themselves. And secondly, not enough time has passed between the Abbasids and the prophet and Abbas that we don't know about them. I think it's pretty accurate that they were actually descendants of the prophet. And also they lived in Al Humayma. That's where the prophet's family settled after the prophet's death. Um, so it's pretty. I think that the claim is pretty good. Personally, I think that, again, if you were going to make a claim, a connection, you would make better than
Yeah,
Abbas, because there were a lot of question marks on Abbas. There were a lot of people who believed that Abbas didn't even convert to Islam. So like I said, that there were question marks on his character. But if you still choose Abbas, then that's uh, yeah. The Fatimids, on the other hand, are a different story. They weren't exactly. But that's a different story. So on the chart, you can't see the chart actually, but the Abbasid Caliphate takes up like half of the chart,
yeah.
because they started in 750 and then they died out in 1258, but then they continued as caliphs all the way to 1516.
Mm.
So like that's around 800 years that they
Now,
served as
now what
caliphs.
I find interesting about the Abbasid, and they kind of are my favorite caliphate to read about, because as one, I don't remember which historians wrote this, but one historian put it this way: that while the Umayyad were a fam- caliphate of conquest, the Abbasids would be a caliphate of science, and they didn't do much conquering. They were more focused on science. But before we go into that, actually want to talk a little bit about the creation of Baghdad and why they didn't settle in, say, the Umayyad Caliphate, and why they chose the location of Baghdad and create a brand new around city at that in and create a brand new capital for the new caliphate.
Hmm. So Muawiyah and the Umayyads had been based in Syria. They were very Byzantine leaning. They like styled themselves as Byzantine emperors pretty much. But it was and the Syrians were happy under the under the Umayyads. But the Persians weren't, because the Persians were treated as second class citizens. So the Persians brought about their own revolution. And the Abbasids had come to power through the support of the Persians. So they moved the capital east into what was very close to like the older Persian capital, Ctesiphon. Baghdad is very close to the city of Ctesiphon. And they moved the capital there, and they started to employ more Persians, and Syrians sort of were pushed out of administration. Um, and that's like part of the reason that they wanted a new capital. They early on were set in Kufa, but the city of Kufa was too associated with the Shias. So they needed a new capital, sort of a custom made capital. And it was under the second caliph, Al Mansur, that in 762 they commissioned a new capital. The capital was a round city because all like these great cities of the Persian empires had been these round cities.
So it
So it was
wasn't a
very much.
new design, to put it that way.
Sorry?
It wasn't a new design, to
Yeah.
put it that way.
It was a very much Persian design. And so it showed them, and there were the architects were Persians as well, and Zoroastrian, I believe, not even Muslim, but Zoroastrian. And they built this city, and one of the reasons that they built this city was to sort of give out land to people who were loyal to them, give them positions of power, and sort this out to keep this new heart of the caliphate, which they could control and they could design it as they wanted. Um, and that's the reason they founded the city of Baghdad. And at the very center of the city of Baghdad was the city of peace, and at the very center of that was the palace, the Golden Gate Palace of the um, Umayyad of the Abbasid Caliph, which is pretty nicely shown in the game Assassin's Creed Mirage.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, that's the reason they built this city, and then that city would eventually become the heart of the Islamic world and the heart of like pretty much all scientific progress in the
Mm.
world. Like outside of maybe China, certainly outside of China. Like China was pretty good at the time, but outside of China, there was no city in the world that could comparison Baghdad for like 200-300 years.
No, I'd rather ask because a few years ago, they not the latest, but Assassin's Creed Shadows Mirage came out, and it's set in the 10th century. And to be honest, I'm not a fan of the game because it's gameplay, and I didn't like. That I loved roaming in the city. It's set in Baghdad, and I loved roaming in the city at the time of the city. But what did you think about the portrayal of Baghdad in the game? Now, I'm not going to talk about the game itself, but the visual of Baghdad in the 10th century, according to Mirage.
I think that's pretty good. In the game, they've got the time period is all muddled up. They're supposed to be in the 860s, but then they are also pulling in things from the 890s and 900s and stuff like that, which is fine.
I mean, it's a
I don't
game. What
mind
do
that.
you expect?
Yeah, I don't mind that, but I think that the portrayal of the city is pretty good because they've got like a lot of, you can imagine that being a Persian city, and that's what Baghdad was. Baghdad was a Persian city.
Hmm.
You can sort of imagine that this is a Persian city, and they've got the Golden Gate Palace in the middle, and so all these things that they had a team of historians. I think the portrayal of Baghdad is pretty good. Like they've got the districts right, and they've got this sort of feel of a metropolitan city. You walking around in the city, you hear Greek, you hear other languages, um, which I think is pretty good. The gameplay, the combat of the game terrible. I didn't like
Oh
that at
yeah.
all. I thought the parkour was pretty good because the city was like dense, and so it was pretty okay.
I never
The
finished the game, to be honest, because of the gameplay. I was not a fan.
yeah,
I get that I wanted to go back to older games, but like it didn't do it for me. I love I'm one of the few probably like Odyssey, so I love that gameplay that they tried to do with Odyssey and Origins. So I'm going from that to Mirage, and I hated Valhalla, of course, but that's another story. But yeah, it's I wasn't a fan of the gameplay at all.
hmm yeah. I also struggled to finish the game, but I was finishing it for the story because I wanted to
Yeah.
make a video on it. And the story, awful, awful story. They had one of the richest settings in world history, and then they completely botched it. There was like awful, awful job with the story. They could have done like there was a slave rebellion going on in the 890s, and they brought it to the 860s. Okay, if you've done that, then do something with it. They didn't do anything with it. It's just one of the guys who were giving you, and it would have been a very interesting thing because the assassins are about freedom of the people,
Hmm.
and the Templars are about control, and so the assassins could have been like supporters of the slave rebellion, and the Templars could have been on the other side. They could have just made the game about the slave rebellion, but they didn't do any of that.
Hmm.
It's just awful.
So and
Uh,
back to the real world, to put it that way. Let's talk a little bit more about the scientific, because as I said earlier, the Abbasids would be be a caliphate of science. So let's talk a little bit about some scientific contribution. You did make a video a couple of years ago. I don't remember how long time ago, about how why the reason we are speaking right now on this computer is because of the Abbasid contribution to science. So let's talk a little bit about the Abbasid contribution and how they are linked to the 21st century computer that we are both are talking in right now.
yeah, it was the Abbasids. They founded the House of Wisdom, Bait al Hikmah, which was essentially at first it was a library, then it became a sort of a research center. And there were scholars from all over the Islamic world who came there, who spoke Arabic, who communicated in Arabic, but they read books from the Greeks, by the Indians, by the Persians, the Egyptians, like everybody, and then they worked further on that. And among the scholars was a guy called Al Khwarizmi, who's on the poster. Matt from Useful Charts and I were just talking about that how this guy, he did so much, and that his name is not very like
Hmm.
a household name in the West.
Probably because
Uh,
he's not white, but
yeah, but we say his name 8 times a day. Algorithm.
yeah.
Algorithm comes from his name, algorithm to al Khwarizmi to algorithm to algorithm. And yet we don't know, like people don't know about him. And he wrote a book called Al Jabr wal Muqabila, uh, which is where we get the word algebra. And without algebra, imagine how many things wouldn't exist today. And our numerals,
And thanks for making math harder, by the way.
yeah, but you need math.
Mm.
You need math for a lot of things. Um, for Muslims, like developing the algebra was basically for inheritance purposes, because the Islamic inheritance law is quite complicated.
Mm.
And so algebra was supposed to be helping with that. But how many things has it done? And then zero. I've talked about this in quite a few videos as well. That every computer that we have, the consumer grade computer that we have, works on binary ones and zeros. Um, Zero was invented by the Indians,
Mm.
and then that book came to Baghdad, and somebody translated it, and then they built it into their own numeral system, and then it went to Europe. And so we have the Indo-Arabic numeral system today, the ones and zeros that we use. That is because of Baghdad. Without Baghdad, I don't know if they could have ever reached Europe, and if we could have ever actually had computers. So like, there's a lot of everything is built upon something. Muslims were working on the works of Indians and Greeks. A lot of the word canon. I was just talking about this. We often say canon in terms like comic book and stuff. Oh, this event is not
Yeah.
canon, or canon event is pretty like meme kind of thing now. The word canon comes from the Arabic word qanun, which means law. Um, and it's because of like these books that came to Europe from Islam that were about the laws of certain things, the laws of medicine, the laws of this, that. It also means rules, so like rules of medicine.
Mm.
And then Qanun
Also, a
became
lot of
canon.
Greek translations, ancient
Yeah,
Greek translations, that have been saved because of Arab contribution to saving
yeah,
some of the ancient work that we have today. And also, of course,
yeah,
a lot of monks in monasteries did this too, so they weren't entirely alone, but a lot of this is because of Arab contribution to this.
yeah, definitely. When the city of Toledo fell in Muslim Spain in 1085, its libraries were open to monks. Christian monks came in and they started studying the works that had been stored there. And so like all of these things, the works, and it's not, I'm not saying that Muslims did everything, but everybody builds on top of other people's works. And we talk about Roman civilization and the Greek civilization, but we don't talk about like this Islamic civilization as much as we should, because of how much contribution was made to science by the funding that the Abbasids did, and other parts of Islam. The Fatimids, for example, patronized Ibn al-Haytham, who did a lot of work on optics. We wouldn't have cameras without him. And so, there's like, everybody did. And in terms of medicine, I was reading this book about sexual health, this 12th century book about sexual
Mm.
health. And they were like big fans of Greeks in that category. They're constantly talking about Greeks. And there's a lot of stuff about women. Like, before today, there was all this misogyny and stuff. Well, even today we have misogyny, but like, so they wanted to justify it. They wanted to justify, why are women lesser than men? They wanted to justify it. And there's like so much creative crap in these
They would have
books.
been cancelled today, to put it
Yeah.
in modern terms.
They were like, so they were talking about these, they were like coming up with medical reasons. And the Greeks also had this idea of temper and heat and stuff. So they said, this sexual health book, it said that women, I think it goes back to Aristotle as well, that women are lesser because a woman is born when the womb of the mother does not have enough heat to make a man, a boy. because heat is good for some reason, and so a woman is basically like not a fully baked child, and so that's the reason that because men are born out of heat, so men are more angry and warrior and this, and women are born not from enough heat, and so they're lesser, and so they have to be protected and all that stuff. And I was like thinking about how, okay, we have patriarchy, sure, you're benefiting from patriarchy, you have that, but so much creative work to justify it is just, it's frankly a little impressive how much work they did on this topic just to
Yeah,
sustain
they had a
patriarchy.
lot of free time, in other
Yeah,
words.
exactly. Yeah. So yeah,
And
there was like a lot of
another thing I want to talk about is, of course, one of the most famous rulers from the Abbasid time is, of course, Harun Al Rashid and
Mhm.
the 1001 Arabian Night. So we kind of have to talk about him, right, when we talk about the Abbasid Caliphate. So let's talk a little bit about Harun Al Rashid and how the famous stories of the 1001 Arabian Nights came to be.
Harun al Rashid's era was known as sort of the golden prime of the Abbasid Caliphate, even though it wasn't. Harun came to power in.
Oh, and I should also add that we have to talk about this. I'm not used to use the term bromance with Charlemagne. Feel like we should mention
Yeah.
that as well.
Okay, so Harun al Rashid came to power in 786. For quite a bit of it, he was not in charge of his own caliphate. His mother was, and then his viziers were. He was not a very hands-on kind of ruler early on, but his era was known as the Golden Prime because immediately after his death, his two sons went to war. And then after that, the Turks came to power, and so things started to go downhill because of that. Um, and so that's the reason that, by comparison, Harun Rashid is remembered as this sort of great ruler. And his stories were mythologized in the Arabian Nights. There were all these stories. Oh yeah, by the way, interesting fact here. I was reading a book. I don't remember the name. I will get back to this. But there was this idea that the genies. The stories about genies are all about be careful what you wish for. Genies
Yeah.
come from the Arabian Night. Um, Oftentimes, when people wished for something from the genies did. They tricked people. If you ask for a mountain of gold, they might drop a mountain of gold on top of you. That's like pointless. So there was this lesson that be careful what you wish for. But at the same time, it seems that there was some sort of like anti other message that these people, they're kind of weird and they're kind of trick, kind of cunning. So these other people, they're kind of clever and they're gonna stab you in the back. Maybe minorities were like that, or maybe slaves were like that. But then there's also the message that since they had been imprisoned for thousands of years within those lamps, they went crazy in there. So there's like this sort of
But I wouldn't
anti-imprisonment,
blame
or
them. So
yeah, exactly.
and there is
There
a
was sort
joke
of
about
this.
this in the Aladdin movie. Sorry, in the Aladdin movie as well. At least the original one. I think there's a joke, or a new one. I think there's a new one. There's a joke about how tiny little space there are in that lamp.
Hmm. Yeah, and genies go crazy, and so that was like this sort of nuanced take on genies and maybe minorities, maybe slaves. Um, so yeah, but anyhow, returning back to Harun al-Rashid, his era was known as a golden prime, and it was mythologized later on. Even though like Harun was not a very good ruler, like he was
I
not a
mean,
good enough ruler to be
I
household name.
would call him a bit of a tyrant if I remember the story correctly. That he killed almost every woman every night until
That's
he
from
was
the Arabian Nights.
satisfied
That's not
with them.
true. That's not true
Hmm?
though. That's from the
Yeah,
Arabian Nights. That's not true though. Um, and then he did have like conversations with Charlemagne, and that was mostly because they both were opponents of the Umayyads in Spain. So they shared some letters, they shared gifts. There was councils here and there. We don't know a lot about those councils other than these European, what can be called exaggerations. Um, but yeah, it was in Aachen that he sent an elephant as well. Abu Abbas, his name was. Um,
but he
I
died on the
mean,
way.
he died on the way. Yeah, certainly. I've read about the journeys. There was some source about his the elephant's journey. I was very curious about that, but I don't remember the whole story because how do you transport an elephant from the Middle East? Probably you got it from Africa, and then you transport it from the Middle East
Hmm.
to France. How do you do that? I was like
Hmm.
a huge deal within itself. Um,
I want to for a second, I'm going to continue into the Fatimids very soon, but I want to talk for a second about why do you think Harun al Rashid so a benefit with the alliance of Charlemagne? Because my theory is that so you have the Umayyad Spain, which we haven't mentioned up until now, because when the Abbasid took over, there was one branch of I don't remember who, but someone escaped and took control of the Umayyad Spain. But my idea is why Harun al Rashid saw the benefit with an alliance with Charlemagne is that he possibly should have seen them as keeping the Umayyads in check in a way that I think that could be a possibility that he saw
yeah,
him as a useful against the Umayyad Spain. That's why they have the alliance. I mean, if you look at the distance between Baghdad and Charlemagne and Aachen, it doesn't seem very logical at all. But when you take the Umayyad Spain, Al Andalusia into accountants as well, I think there's a logic there that they may have thought that this could be helpful if we
yeah.
had and keep the Umayyad Spain in check. Of course, it didn't go out that way in practice, but in my opinion, that must have been the idea behind the alliance.
Yeah, definitely. And um, during the Abbasid period, Harun al Rashid never made any attempts to take Spain, or he never sent an army. We don't know if he did anything in terms of Spain, but certainly Charlemagne was trying to. Charlemagne was entering Spain. He even took Barcelona, and he took the area called the Spanish March. In terms of the Abbasids, they had power as far as Tunisia. They had a dynasty called the Aghlabids there, who were independent in all but name, but they did like consider the Abbasids to be uh, their overlords.
Yeah.
And so there was certainly a sense of hostility between the Spanish Umayyads and the Abbasids, and definitely that's part of the reason that Charlemagne and Harun al Rashid came to conversation. And I think the second reason might have just been because Harun al Rashid was actively engaged in warfare with the Byzantines. And Charlemagne, while not at war with the Byzantines, there was this sense of rivalry. Charlemagne considered himself the Holy Roman
Yeah.
Emperor, and Irene was an empress as well in the
And
Byzantine
it's by the
Empire.
way because Irene wasn't a woman and an empress that he actually was allowed to begin taking the
Yeah.
title of emperor because they didn't like we talked about they viewed women as less inferior as than men, and because
Yeah.
she was a woman, he finally and they respected the Byzantines pretty much up until then, but they finally saw the chance to finally become emperor themselves.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And so there was this sort of two front thing between the Abbasids and the Charlemagnes. Like they had two rivals in common, and that's part of the reason that I like to think there's no historical evidence of this, but I like to think that maybe because these two saw themselves as sort of these great emperors, and they were trying to impress each other by giving them gifts, and
Hmm.
so even though they were distant, they were just maybe curious about each other. uh and there's like Harun al-Rashid was like, oh, there's apparently this great emperor in Europe, and Charlemagne was like, there's apparently this great emperor in Baghdad. And like I said, there's no historical evidence of this, but I like to think that they were
Hmm.
curious about each other as well.
Now, we don't want to not to talk for too much longer, but I want to talk about the rise of the Fatimids and the first Shiite Caliphate and the diminishing of Abbasid power. And of course, we're going to end with the conquest of 1258. I think that's a good ending point for this episode. But let's talk about the rise of the Fatimids and how the Abbasid well, they still were somewhat. I'm not going to hesitate to use the term powerful. They still had quite the influence, but they still weren't kind of wouldn't be kind of like the late Byzantine Empire in a way at that time, and with the rise of the Fatimids. So let's talk about how the Fatimids came to power and kind of would diminish to Abbasid power.
So in the 860s, in 861 specifically, the Caliph al-Mutawakkil was killed. by the Turks. Um, and so the Abbasid Caliphate sort of started to tailspin. It started to lose territory everywhere, and a vacuum, both political and spiritual, started to appear, and people started to go back to the idea that we want a descendant of the Prophet to become caliph. And so there were all these Shia um, groups that like amped up their activities. They started preaching to people about them and themselves, and they started talking about these revolutions and all these ideas. And one of those groups was the Fatimids. They claimed descent from the Prophet through his daughter Fatima, hence the name Fatimid. I don't believe that they were actually descendants of the Prophet, but that doesn't matter, to be honest. And then we go to them in around the year 900, when they were first in Syria, in a city called Salmiya, and then they moved to Tunisia, which Tunisia had a bit of a power vacuum. At the time, it was quite far from Baghdad, and so they set up shop there, and then they led a revolution there with the help of the Berber or Amazigh tribes there. And slowly they rose to power from Tunisia. They took parts of Morocco, parts of Algeria, and they eventually moved on Egypt. In 969, they took Egypt. And what that did was that put the the Fatimids like right next door to the Abbasids. The Abbasids controlled Syria, they controlled Iraq, they controlled Arabia, and the Fatimids were now this rising threat. And the Fatimids were preaching that they were the rightful descendants of the Prophet, and so the rightful caliphs, and the Abbasids were just imposters, they were just pretenders. And so there was like this whole spiritual aspect to it as well. The caliphs, they started to launch propaganda against each other. The Fatimids started launching propaganda against the Abbasids. The Abbasids started launching propaganda against the Fatimids.
I'm sorry for
So this,
pausing for a second, but I want to talk about the fact that I believe at this point we had three caliphs, right?
yes,
With one in Baghdad, one in Cairo, and one in Cordoba. So let's talk a little bit about the, because as we talked about the idea of being emperor as kind of being caliph at least early on meant that you had that had, Medina and Mecca, as that gave you the right for the title of caliph. But how did this work out with actually legitimizing to use the title of caliph and having three different caliphs at the same time? I mean, obviously the Umayyad Spain didn't have the chance to have Mecca or Medina, so let's talk about so for the lack of better words, right to call yourself a caliph, and when you didn't have necessarily Mecca or Medina, or having three different caliphs at the same time, like you said.
mhm. So in the Islamic world, the prime rulership belongs to God, and then the Prophet of God, Prophet Muhammad, has the right to dictate us, to lead us. And then everybody who, like, then he only had his successors, the caliphs. And then the caliphs had all these people who were ruling on their behalf, the emirs. Hence, these early non-caliphate empires, if you want to call them, were called emirates.
Yeah.
Emir just means leader, and so that's what they were. And then around the year 1000, we get the title sultan. Sultan means protector. Basically, it's someone who's protecting the caliph.
Slightly above Emir.
Yeah, slightly above emir. And so, like, all these different, under the at the rise of the the Abbasid Caliphate, all these different empires were claiming to be ruling on behalf of the caliph. The Umayyads were the first ish to break away from that. The Umayyads claimed in Spain they broke away from the Abbasids. They, in the Friday prayer sermon, you would acknowledge the name of the caliph, and they stopped doing that for the Abbasids. They didn't claim to be the caliphs, but they started doing that.
But we should also say that early Umayyad, when they ran away from Damascus, that they didn't call them, were hesitant in calling themselves caliph, at least the
Yeah,
first generations.
that's what I'm
It
saying.
would only be a few generations later that they would begin calling
Mhm.
themselves caliphs.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Then the Fatimids came around, and the title of the caliph became a little bit diluted because the idea was, what claim do the Abbasids have to call themselves the successors of the Prophet? If the Fatimids, they claim descent from the Prophet, so they are more descendants of the heirs of the Prophet, so they decided to call themselves caliph. And so the title of caliph became not as big a deal anymore. And so the Umayyads were like, well, if they're gonna call themselves caliphs, then my ancestors ruled the first caliphate, so we're gonna call them ourselves caliphs.
It's
Um,
not giving the same victory prize to every team that contributed to the football game, even though you lost.
yeah, and they decided to call themselves caliphs as well, and that title was like only three people, no, not three people, but like um only three major caliphs existed in Cordoba. There was Abdurrahman III, Al-Hakam II, and Hisham II, and then the ones after him were like sort of a rolling door, ruled for a couple of months, couple of years, nothing too major. And so that's how the title of the caliph became so diluted. And then the Fatimids claimed that as well, but the Fatimids were dissolved by um, um, uh, Salahuddin
Saladin?
Ayyubi. Yeah, and so there was then only one caliph. But then the title of the caliph had by then became quite diluted. So you had the Almohad Caliphate in Morocco, and then you had the Sokoto Caliphate. So you had like caliphs come and go these days. Not these days, but like after the Fatimids, the title of the caliph became, it wasn't as powerful anymore. Um, and when the Ottomans started using it in the 1700s, um, it might not have become as powerful as it did eventually if it wasn't for the colonial era. Like during the colonial era, people were looking at the Ottomans, they were thinking, we gotta listen to the caliph. He's a leader. He's the leader of the Sunni Islam. Even though, like, yeah, it was kind of flimsy claim. Um, so yeah, that's how the caliph became such a diluted term, and like a lot of different people then claimed to be caliphs.
I think we're gonna end with one last topic, and I think it's a kind of good ending to this episode. Is the Mongol conquest of Baghdad in 1258, and like I said, it will still continue centuries later. So let's talk a little bit about the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate and how later on how they would how they actually would still stay on as prisoners centuries after the fall in 1258.
So during the Fatimid era, the Abbasids had these rivals. They were Shias. They had become weak, but at the same time, in 950, they came to be ruled by the Buids, who were a dynasty from northern Iran, and who were themselves Shias. So they became the overlords of the Abbasid Caliph, and then they were defeated by the Seljuks. The Seljuks were Turkics from Central Asia who came in, defeated the Buids, and then they became overlords of the Abbasid dynasty. And then eventually they became weak. They dissolved. They themselves dissolved. They were defeated by other local tribes, and so the Abbasids became independent. That was in the 12th century, in the 1100s. And at the time, things started to become like the Middle East lacked a major power. The Abbasids were just figureheads. They barely ruled parts of Iraq. When the Khwarezmian Empire was ruling quite a bit of the Middle East, like mainly Iraq and Iran. And it was one of their guys who killed the ambassadors of the Mongol Shah, not Shah, the Mongol Emperor Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan decided to invade because, Genghis Khan, this was an insult. His ambassadors had been killed, and that was like the insult to the highest degree. So
They took
Genghis
that
Khan
very, very seriously, the
yeah,
Mongols.
that was like a very serious matter for the Mongols, and the Mongols invaded in 1219, I believe. 1219.
That's from 1220s, maybe?
Something
Early,
like that.
late 1210s.
Something like that, yeah. And so they invaded, and they took over like much of the Middle East. They conquered all these parts, and then Genghis Khan died in 1229, and then his successors were still
I
active
think it was
throughout.
1227, 1226 he died.
1227 that he died.
I
Was
think
12?
so.
I keep forgetting
It's
dates. He
around
he did
12.
die in 1227. Yes,
Yeah,
1229. Why was I thinking
I'm
he
just
didn't
reading
die?
about the Mongols, so I'm fairly certain it was 1227.
Yeah, it was 1227, and then his descendants continued on. They continued their conquests, and they invaded Anatolia, Muslim Anatolia, which had been taken by the Seljuk Turks. And in the middle of all that, they made a deal with the Abbasid Caliph. Basically, the Abbasid Caliph, without any conflict, decided that I'm going to support you, I'm going to pay tribute and all that. But then he refused to send men for Mongols' war against the assassins. And so things soured between the two, and Hulagu Khan, who was a grandson of Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, he decided to take Baghdad himself. And in 1258, he took Baghdad. He attacked. The siege was
Which
quite
is quite a,
brutal, and
was quite a brutal affair, you
yeah,
must be said.
and he sacked the entire city. Um, but not the entire city, to be honest. There's like a lot of nuance in the whole conversation. There's ideas that these richer suburbs of Baghdad were actually like negotiating with the Mongols. Instead of the Mongols outright sacking them, they were like, "We'll pay you money, just leave." So there's like all this nuance that it deserves a discussion of its own, to be honest. But yeah, they
One of the
sacked.
saddest affairs, in my view, is the fall of the House of Wisdom and the
Yeah,
science. We lost scientific contributions that we lost because of the Mongol invasion. And
a
you
lot
just
of
imagine what we could have had had those papers, academic research survived until the 21st century.
yeah, a lot of research was lost during that process. A lot of people were killed. A lot of books were burnt or destroyed. Overall, like a lot of bloodshed, a lot of destruction happened to
Yeah,
Baghdad.
I'm gonna go ahead and call the fall of the House of Wisdom kind of same on the same scale as the fall of the Library of Alexandria, if that sounds like a fair comparison.
No. Why? Because the fall of the Library of Alexandria, by the time that it fell, it was not much of a library anymore. People talk about it like it was burnt or it was destroyed or this or that, but the library actually just fell into decline. A
That's
lot
fair.
of its research was moved out already. Um, by the time that, let's say, the Muslims came around in 630s, 40s, the library was not the library anymore. It was basically just the library during the Ptolemaic era. And then during the Roman conquest, Alexandria was set on fire, right? And so the library was burned. But still, despite that, it wasn't as much destruction. Like, it's popular to talk about it, but the boring truth is that the library had just
Yeah.
declined. It didn't have as much stuff anymore as it did at its peak, but the Abbasid Caliphate did. The House of Wisdom did still have a lot of research in it. It was still active. Only a few decades ago, the Nizamiya Madrasa had been built. Not the Nizamiya Madrasa, but the Mustantriya Madrasa had been built, which was another school and so on. So we see that Baghdad was still an active site of research for a lot of stuff. Alexandria, by the time that Alexandria fell and the library burned, was not very active in the same way. But yeah, I mean, research was destroyed, people were killed, scholars were killed, and overall, like, it was a big shock to the Islamic world because Baghdad had become the heartland of Islam. This would be like, I mean, this would be not exactly, but like kind of like when 9/11 happened, right? You have this empire that is this huge empire, this
A
huge
lot of
powerful
white
empire.
nationalist Americans are going to be pissed by that comment.
Sure, but
Let them.
there's this city that this sort of universally beloved city, New York, and then it
Yeah.
has this awful thing happen in it. And similar, I think, it was the fall of Baghdad, but on a much larger scale. The Islamic world looked to it for guidance and for just like this was this magical city, right? And then all of a sudden it was destroyed by the Mongols. So yeah, the situation was pretty bad. But
But
the discussion of the fall of Baghdad needs a lot more research. I think that the simple idea that the city was sacked and the Mongols destroyed a lot of research, it's not. It doesn't tell the full picture.
hmm,
There's a lot more there that needs to be discussed, and there's like research going on still, and I think that it's interesting. Like all these simplistic narratives that we have in history, even historians propagate some of them, um, are being looked at again, and we're sort of starting to understand that things might not be as simple as we like
hmm,
to have them, because a lot of these ideas come from the 16th, 17th, and 18th century by people like Edward Gibbon, um, which are just these simplistic views which don't fit in today's world, which we don't like in today's world. And even historians propagate them, but there are challenges to them. For example, even the Battle of Tor, like, how long did people talk about the Battle of Tor being this major battle until
yeah.
only recently started to question it? And same can be said about a lot of things. So yeah.
And I had a few in December. I had Nicholas Morton on. We discussed the Mongol Storm, and we talked about this as well in that episode. But he actually kind of counter argued, yeah, we got lost a lot of research as well, but the Mongols kind of adapted and took kind of in Operation Paperclip way. They kind of took a lot of the scientists and made them work for them. So I kind of got a lot of attributions thanks to the Mongols as well, but because they took a lot of scientists and made them work for the Mongols instead of, say, in the House of Wisdom. So we did get a lot of scientific contributions after even by not just before. Well, we also, like I said, as we lost a lot as well, but we also got a lot from, to quote Nicholas Morton, and you can check it's out there. The episode, I would highly recommend checking it out. But yeah, we did get some scientific progress as well, thanks to the Mongols.
Yeah. Genghis Khan himself used to, whenever he's conquered a city, he would move artisans and people of talent and move them back to Mongolia, or the same was done by Yuan dynasty, the same was done by Elkhan. And so a lot of this continued, but it propagated, not propagated, but it sort of dispersed throughout the Islamic world. Um, the centers of the Islamic world moved to Egypt and to India and to Anatolia and outside of Baghdad. This sort of marks a new era for the Islamic world. I think that a time when Baghdad is no longer the capital of the Islamic world, and Arabs are no longer the dominant ethnic group in the Islamic world. Rather, it's Turks then from that point on.
And I think that is, of course, a story for another time. And this has been, I think we're going to round it up there. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you these past hours. Before you go, of course, where can people find your Islamic poster? I bought one myself, and I'm really looking forward to hanging it up on my wall back in my apartment. And of course, you're working on where can people buy your new timeline that you're working on the Umayyad Spain, and of course, where can your YouTube channel? You have another exciting project coming up. Where can people find your FC account? And of course, social media you want to share or anything else you want to promote, links in you want to add to the description. Now it's your chance to share your work here.
So far the chart has been available on Etsy, but now I've moved it to almuqadimah.com because Etsy takes a lot of money from me. And so because now I know a little bit more about these things, so I have moved everything to almuqadimah.com. So if you want to check out the channel, you'll find links. You'll find everything related to the channel on almuqadimah.com. So just go there. You'll find the charts. You'll find the channel. You'll find the Instagram. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming again. It's been a great pleasure to have you back. You're always welcome back to the podcast. This has been When That Aged Well. Check out our other episodes that we did. I mentioned them in the start, but I'm repeating it now. You can check it out. We did one episode on the origin of Islam, and we also did one on Saladin a few years back. I think it's almost 2 years ago already. It's crazy how time flies. So yeah, definitely check those out. This has been When That Aged Well. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. if you are on Spotify, give us 5 stars, or if you hate this podcast, you should give us one. At least in my part of the world, it's a free world for now, so you're free to do whatever you want. Give as many stars as you want. If you're on Apple Podcasts, leave a review, but write a review. That would be lovely to see. And of course, check out some other episodes. We are on social media. We are on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Stripe, and with that aged well, and trying to move more towards Blue Stripe recently, because I don't like what Twitter has become. I don't think most of us like what it has become these days, to be fair, but make sure to check us out there. And if you have, if you have any suggestions for historians or topics, you're more than welcome to suggest what topic I should do next. And this has been With That Aged Well. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.